Hey guys, what's up? Today I want to talk about 10 JRPGs that were ruined by the release date of other JRPGs that were much more successful, much more popular, and because of that popularity, these other 10 JRPGs didn't enjoy or barely enjoyed any success whatsoever. So let's begin! Number 10. Tales of Destiny. Alright, we're gonna do this list in chronological order. I did some research for older JRPGs, but there wasn't really a lot of competition back then in the West. The late 80s and early 90s was a time when JRPGs were slowly starting to get popular overseas. And sure, RPGs like Chrono Trigger or Phantasy Star 4 practically ruined others like Beyond Oasis for being released around the same time, but like I said, it's a stretch. It wasn't until the late 90s, after the release of Final Fantasy VII, that the genre was strongly popularized. Tales of Destiny was a commercial success in Japan when released on December 23, 1997. However, it wasn't localized until almost a year later to North America on September 30, 1998. This was the very first Tales game ever released in the West, so people didn't know what it was. On top of that, its timing was really bad. 21 days before it, Parasite Eve was released also on the PlayStation on September 9, and it was a huge commercial and critical success. 2 days before, on September 28, Pokémon Red and Blue arrived in the West to a colossal commercial success. And to make things even worse, the long-anticipated Xenogears was released 20 days later on October 20. Ouch! Sure, you all know this game exists, though I doubt most of you have played it. Namco will soon bring it back, or so they promised, but the truth of the matter is, this game was not only ruined when it first came out in the West, as you saw, it was completely crushed from all sides. That's why it took a long time for gamers to know this game existed in the first place, at least not until the Tales series was popularized several years later. Number 9. Suikoden 2. Yes, this is nowadays an extremely popular game that most people have played thanks to emulation or its digital release on the PS3 store. Back when it was first released in the West, it's a completely different story. It came out in Japan on December 17, 1998 to a successful release. Everyone loved it over there. Its localization though, oof, it was just full of problems. Refer to my video of 10 things you didn't know about Suikoden 2 for the whole story. Konami didn't put a lot of effort into the translation and the marketing. Sounds like they didn't even try, right? Well, one thing we're probably ignoring is that it was released until August 31 of 1999. That's only 9 days before Squaresoft's newest colossus, Final Fantasy VIII. Suikoden 2 was a complete failure in the West for all these reasons, and therefore not many copies were printed, which led to physical versions of the game being quite rare and expensive just a few years after its Western release. Sure, I hate Konami like most of you, but back then it's hard not to see how easily they gave up, cause they just didn't stand a chance against Final Fantasy, especially not when Suikoden was very obscure and unknown in the West. Number 8. Skies of Arcadia. This is another RPG that's somewhat popular nowadays, especially since there's two versions of it, one on the Dreamcast and one on the GameCube. Neither version was commercially successful in the West, however, they both failed, specifically the first one. In fact, most of its fans come from the GameCube version, cause fortunately, it didn't have a lot of competition when it came out. Plus, it was one of the very few RPGs on the system, so it got some attention. Not enough, as it was still overshadowed by other games released that very same year, 2003. The original Dreamcast version though was crushed by two major titles, but this one might just take the cake in the entire list. Check this out, It was released in the West on November 13 of the year 2000, the exact same day as Final Fantasy IX! Jesus! This wasn't the first time Sega attempted to compete against Squaresoft. Phantasy Star 4 on the Genesis was released less than a month before Chrono Trigger on the Super Nintendo back in 1995. Both games were very successful though, not Skies of Arcadia, and especially not for being on the already dying Dreamcast. That's right, the final nail in the coffin for this game was being released at the end of the console lifespan, and to bury it 6 feet under, along came Capcom's Breath of Fire 4, released 15 days later on November 28. I mean, damn! Number 7. Shadow Hearts. We aren't done with Squaresoft ruining almost any competition whatsoever back then. Shadow Hearts was released on June 28, 2001 to, well, some commercial success in Japan. Its release date in the West though was a huge mistake done by Midway Games, the publisher. Man, it was released in December 12, 2001. That's only 5 days before the extremely long-awaited giant that was Final Fantasy X. A very sensational game for being Squaresoft's first Final Fantasy on the PS2, with voice acting. This RPG not only did it sink its only competition back then, which was Shadow Hearts, but also games from other genres released around the same time. Perhaps Midway Games wasn't the best company to publish Shadow Hearts, but I do believe that if it had been released a few months earlier, it would have enjoyed a little more commercial success. I don't think the series will still be alive nowadays though, because other factors contributed to its demise, but we'll get to that later. Number 6. Animusha Tactics. You've probably never heard of this game, have you? In fact, I bet you can't believe what you're seeing right now. A grid-based strategy RPG based on the Animusha series. It was exclusive to the Game Boy Advance when it first came out, later re-released digitally on the Wii U. Well, I played it, I finished it, and I really liked it. It's not the best strategy RPG on the Game Boy Advance, but it's pretty solid. However, it makes you wonder, why will Capcom make a spin-off of this series in the form of a tactical game? Well, it's not like they did a lot of advertisement for it, but an even bigger question is, why will they release it 8 days after Fire Emblem The Blazing Blade? Of course it was gonna ruin it. That game was the very first Fire Emblem ever localized outside Japan. So just imagine the anticipation back then from gamers worldwide. Did Capcom truly believe a game released on the same console and of the same subgenre could compete, and with a bizarre spin-off no less? Well, no, it's really hard to compete against Nintendo's first-party games even if they were developed by a subsidiary. And 2 months before that, on September 8, Final Fantasy Tactics Advance had been released. What was Capcom thinking, man? Number 5. Shadow Hearts Covenant. I told you we were gonna go back to this. Yes, the direct sequel to the original Shadow Hearts was also a commercial fiasco. Released in February 19, 2004, this sequel fortunately did better than its predecessor, and also fortunately it was praised by critics in the West when it came out on September 27 of that same year. Unfortunately, it was the talk of the show for a very short period of time. One game that was anticipated that year, quite anticipated, was a certain RPG from Atlus. Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne was released in North America 15 days later on October 12. Sure, Nocturne wasn't as commercially successful over here as it was in Japan a year before. It also had a strong competition called Paper Mario, The Thousand Years Door, released just the day before on October 11 here in North America. So imagine 2 giant RPGs competing against each other and ruining what little possibility a badass sequel have. Nope, this didn't kill the franchise, but it sure as hell contributed greatly to its demise. If you wanna know more, watch my video on what the hell happened to Shadow Hearts. Number 4. Suikoden 5. We've already established that the Suikoden series never really did very well in the West. Their popularity started much later thanks to the internet. Suikoden 5 is still the only main game in this series without a digital re-release. Thank you, Konami, go to hell. The truth is, Suikoden 4, even though it sold fairly and barely well, failed in reviews, so Konami didn't have a lot of hope for this one. Once again, barely any advertisement was done when it was first released here on March 21, 2006. 7 days later though, Square struck once again, and this time with a huge bomb, Kingdom Hearts 2. Imagine the anticipation for this sequel, imagine all the millions of fans of the first game waiting for it. So when it came out, it grabbed, of course, all the gaming attention back then and enjoyed both a ginormous critical and commercial success. All this while my favorite Suikoden game faded into oblivion. I also have a video on this particular game that I'll leave at the end if you want to know more. Number 3. Wild Arms 5. This is a game whose ruin wasn't as harsh as some of the other RPGs we've seen today, but yet another very important release totally crushed it. Not only one, but two. Wild Arms enjoyed a lot of popularity and success for a long time since the release of the first game back in 1996. The fourth game, however, didn't sell well though, and it received very mixed reviews. On August 28 of 2007, Sony and MediaVision thought by celebrating the 10th anniversary of the series in the West, will bring back love and attention to Wild Arms. This celebration was done in the form of Wild Arms 5, in a special edition with an art book. However, they weren't counting on two major issues though. 14 days before Sony released this game in the West, Atlus had revived the Persona series with a brand new title, Persona 3. While not a huge commercial success, at least not until the fast version the following year, critics and gamers were way more interested in it. A revival of a series thought dead, critically successful and highly innovative? Who the hell will care about my favorite Wild Arms game? That's not all, folks. Today it may be a forgotten and underrated series, but back then, Dot Hack was huge. Everybody was anticipating the third and final volume of the GU trilogy on the PS2. The second had been released on May 8, and Namco said the third one will also be released that year. On September 10, merely 12 days after Wild Arms 5 had been released, Dot Hack GU Volume 3 Redemption came out. Still nowadays no digital re-release or anything on this underrated game. And you wanna know what other JRPG was crushed between Persona 3 and Dot Hack back then? Jeanne d'Arc on the PSP, released on August 21, developed by Level 5. Both these games never stood a chance, so pick your loser, guys. Number 2. Tokyo Xanadu. In 2017, the PS Vita was already dead in the West. Sony barely cared about it for the first few years, we all know that. Why would Axis Games release a brand new Falcom game in the West exclusively for the Vita? Beats me. It was successful in Japan because it came out on September 30, 2015, but it took almost 2 years to bring it over here on June 30 of 2017, when nobody cared anymore about my beloved Vita. However, since in 2016 in Japan an EX Plus version of this game had been released on the PS4, Axis Games thought the game will be more successful if they localize that version too, and in no time actually, 5 months after its Vita release in the West, on December 8, 2017, Axis released Tokyo Xanadu for both the PS4 and Microsoft Windows. Yeah, it failed again. This time mostly thanks to yet another extremely anticipated RPG, Xenoblade Chronicles 2, an exclusive on the Switch released worldwide the very 1st of December of 2017. You're probably thinking, why would a Switch exclusive compete against a PS4 game, right? Do you really want me to explain how small Axis Games is compared to Nintendo themselves? Anyway, this is a great action RPG by Falcom. Give it a chance if you can. Number 1. The Langrisser 1 and 2 remakes. I've done a lot of publicity to this game because I loved Warsong on the Genesis, which is the first Langrisser. The second one was never released outside Japan until this remake for modern systems. Rumors started a few years back, so all fans were finally happy to see it come to life on March 10, 2020. Some criticism was there on the graphics, but overall, people loved it. This happened less than 2 years ago, so you probably remember very well what other 2 games were released around the same time, right? If you don't, let me refresh your memory. Persona 5 Royal was released on March 31, 21 days later after the Langrisser remakes. On April 10 though, perhaps the most anticipated JRPG of all time was also released, Final Fantasy VII Remake. I don't think I need to explain more. Honestly, I feel like Langrisser was merely just an appetizer to a much bigger meal, and it's not like it ever stood a chance in the first place, as these 2 games belong to a very obscure series that never enjoyed any success whatsoever in the West. And poor Sakura Wars was released 8 days after Final Fantasy VII Remake. Too soon in my opinion. It's sad, isn't it? Sega still trying to compete against Square after all these years. It's like they'll never learn. And there's a lot more JRPGs that were ruined by other JRPGs that I left out in today's video. I mean, imagine how many of them were also ruined by the release of this guy right here. In my opinion, it's never a good idea to release your game around the same time another huge, long anticipated game from a big publisher is released. That's all for today, guys. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and share this video with your friends. See you next time!